Comrades, hear this and let it burn in your minds. The chains that bind you are not the visible iron of prison bars, nor the sharp lash of some tyrant's whip. No, they are subtler, more insidious. They are the rules, the laws, the customs, the invisible codes imposed by the ruling class, whispered into your consciousness as morality, legality, and necessity. Every time you bow to their edicts, every time you obey without question, you tighten your own fetters, and the cage of oppression closes further around you. Consider this: the worker rises at dawn, labours without reprieve, consumes what little the market allows, and bows before the altar of wage and debt. Every rule, every contract, every regulation tells you obedience is virtue, conformity is safety. Yet each act of compliance is not a protection, it is a lock. Each submission is a nail driven into the coffin of your freedom. The capitalist assures you that the system is fair, that justice exists, that your labour is rewarded. But the truth, which the ruling class conceals with an artful ideology, is that the more you obey, the more your labour is stolen, your life is consumed, and your spirit is trapped. You have been taught to see your poverty, your hunger, your exhaustion as personal failings. You have been made to believe that hardship is deserved, that inequality is natural, that rebellion is folly. This is the ideology of the ruling class, a sophisticated illusion designed to divide, to pacify, and to render your chains invisible. But do not be deceived. The system thrives not because it is just, but because it is obeyed. It survives on the quiet complicity of the oppressed, on the acceptance of rules that were made not for your benefit, but for the consolidation of wealth and power in the hands of a few. Look at the world through the lens of class struggle, and the mechanisms of your enslavement are revealed. Every law that governs labour, every decree that regulates commerce, every societal expectation that praises obedience over freedom is a tool wielded by the bourgeoisie to maintain dominance. They say, work hard, follow the rules, trust in order, and you obey. And in your obedience, the wealth you create is siphoned upward, the power to shape. Your life is taken from your hands, and the illusion of choice is maintained. Obedience has been sanctified as morality, yet it is the grave of your liberty. Comrades, the solution is not in better obedience, not in pleading for fairness, not in adjusting to the system's arbitrary standards. The solution is in consciousness. The oppressed must see themselves as they are, the creators of all wealth, the producers of all value, the hands upon which society rests. Your labour is the force that drives this world, yet it is exploited, alienated, and rendered powerless by the very rules you are told to respect. Rise, then, in understanding and in unity. Organize not to petition for scraps, but to seize control. Educate yourselves in the truth of your exploitation, and recognize the strength inherent in your collective power. The factory, the office, the farm, the street, these are not prisons if you unite. They are the instruments through which the working class can reclaim the wealth it produces, overthrow the structures that confine it, and replace obedience to the oppressor with freedom for all. The more you obey, the more trapped you become. But the more you unite, the more you act collectively, the more the walls of this cage can crumble. Your chains were forged by law, by custom, and by ideology, but they can be broken by knowledge, solidarity, and revolutionary action. The proletariat is not doomed to passive compliance. On the contrary, it is the force capable of dismantling the oppressive rules, abolishing the domination of capital, and creating a society where labour serves life, not profit, and obedience is replaced by conscious freedom. Let this truth ignite you. The rules exist to bind you, but your collective strength exists to break them. Every act of blind submission is a nail in the coffin of your own potential. Every act of organized resistance is a hammer striking the chains of oppression. The history of mankind has always been the history of struggle between those who exploit and those who are exploited. Today, as always, the power to overturn the tyranny of rules lies in your hands, in your solidarity, and in your refusal to obey the law of the oppressor. The trap is real, comrades, but so is your power. The more you understand it, the more you reject it, the more you act together, the closer you come to freedom. Obedience is the instrument of oppression, resistance is the instrument of liberation, and the time to wield it is now. Obedience is not virtue. Obedience under capitalism is enslavement. The ruling class demands submission under the guise of order, fairness, and law, yet each act of compliance deepens the chains that bind the working class. When a worker rises each morning to labor under the rules dictated by employers, regulations, and social norms, they are not exercising freedom. They are reinforcing their own subjugation. The system presents these rules as necessary structures, as natural limitations, as moral imperatives, but in truth they are instruments of exploitation carefully designed to perpetuate inequality and maintain the power of those who profit from labor they do not themselves perform. Every moment spent following the dictates of this system is a moment in which the worker surrenders agency over their life, allowing the capitalist to extract not only labor but also the very dignity and potential of the person who labors. Observe the subtlety of this enslavement. Obedience is framed as rational, as moral, as the proper path to survival. You are told that if you follow the rules, if you meet the quotas, respect authority, and conform to the routines of production, you will be safe, rewarded, or at least tolerated. Yet the rewards are illusory, always partial, always insufficient to offset the extraction of your labor and the diminution of your autonomy. The capitalist does not need to coerce openly. The law, social norms, and the ideology of merit do the work for them. By obeying, workers participate in the very system that exploits them. They reinforce the structures that define success in terms of profit rather than human need, that measure value by market output rather than human potential. Obedience becomes a chain, each link forged by the worker's own acceptance of rules that were designed to control and dominate. Consider the workplace. The rules of punctuality, discipline, efficiency, and hierarchy are often presented as neutral or even beneficial. Yet each of these rules serves to maximize profit for the capitalist while minimizing the autonomy and creativity of the worker. A factory line, an office schedule, a sales target, each is a mechanism for control. The worker who obeys does not merely perform tasks, they internalize the demands of a system that sees human life as expendable labor. Each rule they follow trains them to prioritize the profit of others over their own freedom, to submit to authority rather than question it, to see compliance as moral rather than recognizing it as the machinery of exploitation. Obedience becomes habitual, and habits, once ingrained, obscure the recognition of oppression itself. The cost of obedience is not only material, it is psychological, moral, and spiritual. Every time a worker sacrifices their time, energy, or creativity to follow the rules of a system that exploits them, they internalize the logic of their own subordination. The ideology of merit tells them that failure to thrive is a personal flaw rather than a structural inevitability, that the rules they obey are fair even when they are designed to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. This internalization is the most insidious form of enslavement, for it convinces the worker to participate willingly in their own oppression. Obedience shapes consciousness, making it easier for the capitalist to extract labor, to enforce hierarchy, and to maintain inequality without open violence. The more the worker obeys, the less they perceive the power they already hold collectively, the less they recognize their potential to challenge and overturn the system. History offers countless examples of obedience functioning as enslavement. In every society where a minority controls wealth and property, rules have been written to maintain their dominance. The feudal serf obeyed the edicts of the lord, believing the obligations imposed upon them were natural, inevitable, or divinely sanctioned. Today, the wage laborer obeys the rules of capitalist production, believing compliance is safety, reward, or morality. In both cases, obedience does not liberate, it chains. The more one submits to the laws, schedules, quotas and norms imposed by those in power, the more one participates in the construction of one's own cage. Yet obedience is not merely passive, it is active complicity. Every day that the worker follows rules without question, they affirm the legitimacy of a system that values profit over life, efficiency over creativity, and control over freedom. This complicity extends beyond the workplace into all social institutions, the legal system, education, and cultural norms, all of which reinforce obedience as a virtue and mask the mechanisms of exploitation. By following the rules, the worker consents to their own dispossession, their labor appropriated, their potential diminished, and their autonomy denied. In this sense, obedience is the key that locks the cage from within, and the very act that is celebrated as virtue becomes a tool of enslavement, sustaining the system that profits from human submission. Ideology is the invisible hand that shapes perception, the unseen force that persuades the oppressed to accept their own subjugation as natural, inevitable and deserved. Poverty, inequality, and hardship are not mere accidents of life, they are structural consequences of the capitalist system, yet they are presented to the working class as personal failings, moral deficiencies, or lack of effort. This framing serves a precise purpose. It ensures compliance, sows division among the oppressed, and obscures the mechanisms of exploitation that produce suffering. Ideology is not passive, it is an active tool wielded by the ruling class to maintain control, to conceal the truth of economic relations, and to prevent the awakening of collective consciousness that threatens their power. The worker is led to blame themselves for their poverty, to feel shame for their hunger, and to internalize the rules of a system that systematically exploits them. Under capitalism, the conditions that generate inequality are often naturalized through narratives of merit, morality, and personal responsibility. The poor are told that their struggle is the result of laziness, ignorance, or lack of ambition, while the rich are celebrated as virtuous, industrious, and deserving. Education, media, religion, and political discourse all participate in the construction of this ideology, producing a perception of reality that obscures the structural roots of oppression. The worker sees the success of the capitalist not as the product of systemic exploitation and inherited advantage, but as a model of moral virtue to emulate. Similarly, the suffering of the working class is individualized and moralized, presented as evidence that they have failed to measure up to societal standards, rather than evidence of systemic injustice. In this way, ideology ensures that blame remains internalized rather than directed at the structures of power that generate it. This internalization of failure has profound consequences for social and political action. When poverty is understood as a personal shortcoming rather than a product of systemic inequality, the oppressed are less likely to unite in resistance. Competition between workers is encouraged. Instead of recognizing their shared exploitation, they are pitted against one another in pursuit of scarce resources, promotions, or validation within the system. Each worker, convinced of their individual responsibility for success or failure, becomes isolated in their struggle, and solidarity, the very force capable of challenging the ruling class, is weakened. The ideology of individual responsibility thus functions as a divider, fragmenting the working class, eroding collective power, and perpetuating the very inequalities it claims to explain. The illusion of choice and freedom is central to this ideological control. The capitalist system encourages the belief that anyone who works hard enough, follows the rules, and makes the right decisions can rise above poverty. Yet this promise is a carefully constructed myth. The structural barriers that prevent mobility, wage extraction, labor alienation, limited access to education, and systemic discrimination remain invisible under the lens of ideology. The worker is taught to see obstacles as personal challenges to overcome, rather than as structural conditions imposed by a system designed to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few. In obeying these rules and believing in the fairness of the system, the oppressed reproduce their own marginalization, their labour extracted without recognition, their rights denied, and their collective potential suppressed. History is a testament to the power of ideology in masking oppression. In feudal societies, the divine right of kings and the moral hierarchy of nobility justified the subjugation of peasants. Under colonial regimes, narratives of racial superiority naturalized exploitation and dispossession. In the modern capitalist era, meritocracy, consumerism, and individualism serve similar functions. They produce the illusion that the system is fair, that wealth is earned through effort, and that poverty is deserved. Ideology operates not merely through coercion but through consent. The oppressed internalize the narratives that justify their own exploitation and perceive compliance as moral, rational, and inevitable. The result is a working class constrained not only by material conditions but by the very way it perceives the world. Poverty is understood as failure, inequality as natural, and hardship as a moral test. Ideology conceals the structural realities of capitalism and ensures that the energy, frustration, and anger of the oppressed are misdirected inward or toward one another, rather than toward the true source of exploitation. It is a form of domination that is deeper and more insidious than brute force, for it shapes thought, belief and perception, ensuring that oppression continues even when the chains of the worker appear invisible. Yet recognition of ideology is itself a revolutionary act. To understand that poverty is not personal failure, that inequality is not natural, and that hardship is not deserved, is to pierce the veil of capitalist illusions. Consciousness of structural oppression allows the working class to see its shared interests, to recognize the mechanisms that divide it, and to unite in collective action against the system that seeks to suppress them. Awareness of ideology is the first step in breaking the chains of exploitation, reclaiming agency, and building a society where life is measured not by compliance or profit, but by justice, equality, and freedom. Labour is the source of all value. It is the creative force through which society produces the goods and services that sustain life, the energy that transforms raw materials into the necessities and luxuries upon which human existence depends. Yet under capitalism, the worker's labour is not recognized as power, it is appropriated, commodified, and alienated. The worker produces not for themselves, not for the collective benefit of society, but for the accumulation of profit by those who own the means of production. Every hour of toil, every skill applied, every ounce of effort invested is converted into wealth that enriches others while leaving the labourer in relative scarcity. Labour is not merely an economic activity, it is the fundamental measure of human agency and creativity. When that labour is stolen, when its fruits are claimed by another, the worker is denied both the reward and the autonomy that are their rightful due. This theft is not incidental or accidental. It is the very mechanism through which capitalism sustains itself. Observe the worker on the factory floor, in the office, on the farm, or in the workshop. Every movement, every task, every decision contributes to production. Yet the value created is never theirs to claim. The capitalist sets the terms, the worker receives a wage, a fraction of the wealth they generate, while the remainder is extracted as profit. The labourer is thus alienated not only from the product of their labour, but from the act of labour itself. Work, which could be an expression of human creativity, collaboration, and purpose, becomes a means of survival, a coerced activity in which the worker's energy is directed by another's will. The product of their efforts, whether it is a garment, a machine, or a service, is appropriated, exchanged, and consumed without connection to its creator, reinforcing the separation between the worker and the power they wield. This alienation extends beyond the material into the psychological and social spheres. The worker sees their own time and effort transformed into wealth that they cannot control. The knowledge that one's labour enriches others while sustaining one's own deprivation produces frustration, resentment, and a profound sense of disempowerment. The more the worker produces, the richer the capitalist becomes, the more effort expended, the greater the alienation. Labour, in this sense, becomes both the instrument of oppression and the source of revolutionary potential. For the very act of production, when understood collectively, contains the power to reshape society, redistribute wealth, and dismantle the structures that enable its theft. Capitalism masks this appropriation by framing labor as a transaction between free individuals. The worker sells their labor and the employer buys it. The ideology of the market presents this as a fair exchange, as though the worker willingly consents to the extraction of their power, yet this consent is constrained by necessity, hunger, debt, lack of opportunity, and the threat of destitution force compliance. The worker is compelled to sell their labor not as an exercise of freedom, but as a condition of survival. The market conceals coercion with the illusion of choice, and in doing so legitimizes the appropriation of labor while obscuring the reality that the worker, collectively, holds the true source of all wealth. History demonstrates that labor, when organized and recognized as the foundation of wealth, is a revolutionary force. The feudal peasant who toiled in the fields, the artisan of the guild, the factory worker in the industrial era, all generated value that was expropriated by those in power. Yet every act of labor contains within it the potential for transformation. When workers unite, when they understand that the wealth they create is the source of society's prosperity, they discover the means to challenge the system that alienates them. The factory, office, or workshop becomes not merely a site of exploitation, but a site of potential liberation, where collective organization can convert stolen labor into collective control. Labor is power because it sustains society, produces wealth, and shapes the material conditions of human life. Under capitalism, this power is hidden, misdirected, and stolen. The worker labors not to serve themselves or their community, but to enrich those who own the instruments of production, while the worker remains dependent, exploited, and estranged from their own creativity. Yet recognition of this reality is the first step toward reclaiming that power. When workers understand that the wealth of society is the product of their collective labor, they realize that the structures that dominate them are not eternal, natural, or unchallengeable. Labor, once alienated, can be reclaimed. Labor, once appropriated, can be redirected. The power that is stolen under capitalism can, through consciousness and collective action, become the instrument of liberation, the foundation of a society where work serves life rather than profit, and where the fruits of labor belong to those who produce them. Collective consciousness is the cornerstone of liberation. The workers' oppression under capitalism is not only material but intellectual, social, and ideological. The ruling class ensures that the mechanisms of exploitation are obscured, a division and competition replace solidarity, and that individuals see their struggles as isolated misfortunes rather than shared conditions imposed by systemic inequality. To dismantle the chains of capitalism, the working class must develop awareness not simply of their own suffering, but of the structures, laws, and ideologies that enforce and perpetuate it. This awareness, this collective understanding of one's own position within the social and economic hierarchy, is the first and most indispensable weapon in the revolutionary arsenal. Without consciousness, labor remains fragmented, the working class remains divided, and the system remains secure, drawing strength from the ignorance and passivity of the very people it exploits. The capitalist system thrives on division. Workers are taught to compete for jobs, recognition, and scarce resources, often pitted against one another along lines of race, gender, nationality, or skill. This division is deliberate. It prevents the formation of solidarity that could challenge the extraction of labor, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Ideology reinforces this separation by instilling beliefs in meritocracy, individual responsibility, and personal failure. The worker internalizes these beliefs, seeing themselves as alone in their struggle, and the collective power inherent in the proletariat is rendered inert. Consciousness, however, reveals the truth. These divisions are artificial, constructed by those who profit from them, and the suffering experienced by one worker is intimately connected to the exploitation endured by all. Recognition of this shared condition transforms isolation into unity, ignorance into awareness, and powerlessness into potential strength. Class consciousness is not a passive realization. It is an active process of education, dialogue, and organization. Workers must examine the structures of production, the appropriation of their labor, and the laws and ideologies that legitimize inequality. They must recognize that the profits of the capitalist are derived directly from their toil, that the system is maintained not by necessity but by consent manufactured through ideology, and that the only path to freedom lies in collective action. Awareness alone does not suffice, but it is the necessary precursor to mobilization. Without understanding the mechanisms of exploitation, the working class cannot hope to dismantle them. Consciousness transforms discontent into strategy, suffering into resistance, and passive obedience into revolutionary will. Solidarity amplifies the power of consciousness. When workers recognize their shared exploitation and unite in purpose, the system that relies on their fragmentation becomes vulnerable. Labor, once dispersed and isolated, becomes a collective force capable of challenging capital, seizing control of production, and redefining the conditions of social and economic life. Collective consciousness fosters mutual understanding, shared goals, and coordinated action. Strikes, protests, unions, and movements are not merely responses to immediate grievances. They are expressions of the recognition that the power of the working class resides in its unity, and that when workers act together, the exploitation of capitalism can be contested and ultimately overturned. The development of class consciousness also illuminates the distinction between temporary concessions and lasting change. Capitalism may offer reforms, high wages, improved working conditions, social programs, but these are superficial adjustments designed to preserve the system rather than challenge it. Awareness allows the working class to see beyond the immediate and the cosmetic, to understand that the root of oppression lies in the appropriation of labor, the concentration of wealth, and the ideological control maintained by the ruling class. Consciousness transforms limited struggles for amelioration into strategic campaigns for systemic transformation, where the goal is not merely survival within the system but the dismantling of the system itself. History demonstrates the decisive role of collective consciousness in revolutionary change. The greatest upheavals, the most profound shifts in human society, have occurred when the oppressed recognize their shared power and act in concert to reclaim it. The proletariat, by virtue of its position as the producer of all wealth, holds the material and social means to reshape society. Yet this potential remains unrealized without awareness and unity. Each worker, in isolation, is constrained by the rules, ideology, and structures imposed by the ruling class. Together, informed and organized, the working class is capable of asserting control over production, abolishing the structures of exploitation, and creating a society where labor serves life, community, and freedom rather than profit. Collective consciousness, therefore, is both a shield and a sword. It shields the working class from the divisions, illusions, and manipulations imposed by the ruling class, and it serves as the weapon through which oppression can be challenged and dismantled. Awareness of exploitation allows workers to recognize their own value. Solidarity allows them to act with coordinated strength, and together these tools transform subjugation into agency, isolation into unity, a despair into revolutionary possibility. The path to liberation begins in the mind of the collective, for the awareness that one is exploited and the realization that one is not alone are the conditions through which the chains of capitalism can be broken. Revolution is the culmination of awareness, solidarity, and the recognition of labor's true power. Under capitalism, obedience is presented as moral, rational, and necessary, but in reality, It is a tool of subjugation. Every act of compliance, every moment spent following the rules of the system reinforces the extraction of labor, the concentration of wealth, and the alienation of the worker. Freedom, therefore, cannot be granted within the existing framework of obedience. It must be seized through organized, united action. Revolution is not an abstract idea or a distant hope. It is the practical, material process through which the working class asserts control over the conditions of its life and labor, overturning the structures that perpetuate inequality and exploitation. The path to freedom begins when obedience is recognized not as virtue but as enslavement, and when collective action is understood as the vehicle through which emancipation is achieved. The capitalist system is fortified by the illusion of order. Laws, contracts, hierarchies, and ideologies all create the appearance of stability and fairness, yet their purpose is to maintain the dominance of the ruling class. Obedience sustains this structure by ensuring that labor is extracted efficiently, that dissent is minimized, and that the oppressed remain divided. The worker who follows the rules without question participates in the perpetuation of a system designed to exploit them. Revolution, in contrast, transforms obedience into conscious defiance, converting the energy once spent in submission into coordinated collective action aimed at dismantling the machinery of exploitation. It is the recognition that the rules serve the oppressor, not the oppressed, and the decisive choice to reject them in favor of freedom. Organized action is essential because the power of the working class is social and collective, not individual. One worker alone can be replaced, suppressed, or ignored, but a united class cannot be so easily silenced. Strikes, occupations, unions, councils, and committees are not merely tactical maneuvers. They are expressions of the realization that the source of all wealth resides in labor itself, and that when workers act together, they wield the power to control production, redistribute resources, and reshape society. Revolution is born from the recognition of this collective strength, from the understanding that obedience must be abandoned in favor of coordinated effort, and from the commitment to struggle not merely for reforms, but for the abolition of a system that thrives on inequality. Freedom is not simply the absence of chains, it is the active exercise of control over one's life, labor, and community. Under capitalism, labor is alienated, wealth is concentrated, and decision-making is reserved for the few who own the instruments of production. Revolution transforms this condition by returning the power of creation and production to those who actually generate wealth. Work becomes not a means of survival imposed by necessity, but a cooperative, creative, and purposeful activity serving human needs rather than profit. The laborer, once trapped in the cycle of obedience and extraction, becomes an agent of change, contributing to a society structured around justice, equality, and collective well-being. Freedom, therefore, is inseparable from the abolition of the structures that enforce obedience and from the establishment of social control over the means of production. The history of social transformation demonstrates that revolution is never spontaneous. It arises from struggle, organization, and awareness. Reforms, concessions, or temporary improvements are insufficient, as they can be co-opted or reversed by the system that created them. Only sustained, united action aimed at dismantling the foundations of capitalism can create lasting change. The oppressed must recognize that their liberation is inseparable from the liberation of the class as a whole. Individual efforts, no matter how heroic, cannot break the chains that bind society, only the collective. Organized power of those who produce the wealth of the world can overturn the structures of domination and establish a society in which labor serves humanity rather than profit. Revolution is both a process and a goal. It begins with consciousness, grows through solidarity, and is realized through coordinated action. It transforms fear into courage, submission into agency, and exploitation into empowerment. Obedience, once internalized as a moral imperative, is rejected as a tool of domination, and the working class discovers its ability to act collectively to determine its own destiny. The chains of capitalism, which rely on division, alienation, and submission, can be shattered when the oppressed recognize that they are not powerless, that their labor is the source of all wealth, and that united action is the instrument of liberation. The ultimate aim of revolution is not simply to replace one ruling elite with another, but to restructure society so that labor becomes a means of sustaining human life and flourishing rather than enriching the few. Freedom is realized when obedience to exploitation is abolished, when the collective power of the working class is exercised to create a just, equitable, and humane society, and when humanity no longer measures itself by profit, hierarchy, or domination. Revolution transforms obedience into liberation, alienation into empowerment, and exploitation into social ownership, ensuring that labor serves life rather than capital, and that freedom is no longer an abstract ideal but the living reality of all people. Comrades, the truth is clear. Obedience under capitalism is not safety, it is enslavement. The rules we are told to follow exist not to protect us but to bind us. Labor is our power, yet it is stolen and alienated. Ideology conceals this exploitation, turning hardship into personal shame, and only through collective consciousness and united action can we reclaim what is ours. The chains that bind us are neither natural nor permanent. They are forged by those who profit from our submission, and they can be broken by the conscious, organized, and determined struggle of the working class. Revolution is not a distant dream. It is the inevitable assertion of our collective power, the awakening of a class that produces all wealth and sustains all life. To obey is to be trapped. To resist together is to be free. The time has come to reject compliance, to cast off the illusions of fairness and merit, and to seize control of our labor, our lives, and our destiny. Only when we unite and act with conscious purpose can we dismantle the structures of oppression and create a society where labor serves humanity, not profit, and freedom is no longer a promise but a living reality for all.